Thank you very much for the invitation. I must say I was quite shocked to receive it. I was shocked to receive an invitation to speak about wisdom, especially from Boaz, who should know me better than that. Because I really don't know anything about wisdom, I'm going to approach the question from the back door. And instead, I'm going to talk about ignorance. So here's a fact from a 2012 National Science Foundation survey. 25% of Americans don't know that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa. Quite shocking, I found, although it's reflective of human nature. We actually don't know that much. I think this question, are Americans aware of their ignorance, sort of answers itself, right? So not only do we tend to be ignorant, but we tend not to know that we're ignorant. And this has been demonstrated formally by Rosenblit and Kyle, and Frank Kyle has done a number of studies that verify this phenomenon. So the way the experiment works is you ask people how well they understand something, like a speedometer or a sewing machine or a toilet. That's everyone's favorite example. And you ask them on a scale from 1 to 7 how well they understand, and people feel they understand, and they give a judgment in the mid-range of the scale. And then you say, OK, how's it work? Explain it to me. And then people realize they don't understand because they can't generate an explanation. So when you next ask them how well they understand, they give a lower number. And that's what Rosenblit and Kyle showed here. So this is called the illusion of explanatory depth, right? The illusion that we think we understand how things work when in fact we don't. And in work with Phil Fernbach, Todd Rogers, Craig Fox, we've shown that this applies to politics as well. So we ran a study using a variety of different political issues that were relevant in the 2012 election, at least relevant to the American population, and we used the standard method, except we didn't only ask people to rate their understanding, we also asked them to rate their position on the issue, what their attitude was. So first they rated their position, whether they're strongly for or against, then they rated their understanding, and then again they attempted to explain, and then re-rated their understanding and their position. And what we found was that prior to explanation, their judgments of understanding were higher than their judgments of understanding post-explanation. And we've replicated this a dozen or so times. It's a very robust effect. It also turns out that people were less extreme in their position after attempting to explain their position. So this is their position extremity, so the difference between their judged position on an issue and the midline of the rating scale, right? So this is the average of those absolute differences, and you can see that they were more extreme prior to explanation than after explanation. This is running out of batteries. So why? Why do we have this illusion? And one possibility is illusion's great, right? I mean, what would we do without illusion? Another possibility is that it's because we fail to distinguish what we know from the knowledge that's around us, from the knowledge that's in the world, including the knowledge in other people's heads. So that's what I want to demonstrate in the rest of this talk. I call this, following the work of some philosophers as well as psychologists like Kyle, I call this the community of knowledge. And the way Kaminsky and Kyle said it was, people conflate the knowledge they can access, including knowledge in other people's minds, with the knowledge in their own. And there are related ideas that have been running through the field for a while. Given that I only have 10 minutes, I'm not going to describe those, but we can come back to them in question period if you're interested. So in work with this undergrad, Nat Rab, we took a frontal assault on this problem. So we compared people's judgments for a few different phenomena that we made up based on whether other scientists had explained whether these phenomena or had not yet explained these phenomena. Okay, so we made up phenomena like this new rock, glowing rocks, right, which we hadn't encountered. And we said that they'd been discovered, and in one condition, we called it the non-COK, the non-community of knowledge condition. We said scientists haven't yet explained how this works. Right? We repeat it here. They do not yet understand how it works. They just provided a description of the remarkable appearance. And in another condition, people get exactly the same information, except they're told scientists have thoroughly explained how it works, and they fully understand how it works. And otherwise, the questions people are asked are identical. And we ran this study online using Mechanical Turk, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We had a few different stimuli. And we had detailed instructions that we gave people, which I'm not going to bore you with. Basically, what we find is that these are novel phenomena. People shouldn't understand how they work because they've never seen them before. And indeed, our ratings are very low. But they're lower, and significantly lower, when scientists do not understand them than they are when scientists do understand them. And this, again, a very robust effect. We have found it multiple times. It occurred for all the stimuli we showed, etc. So those of you who are paying attention, I'm sure, are coming up with alternative explanations for this phenomenon. And there are a variety of them. What I'd like to propose is that all the alternative explanations that you have in mind communally can be divided into two classes. So on one hand, there are alternative accounts that depend on understandability. So the fact that scientists have explained this phenomenon suggests that it's more understandable than cases in which scientists haven't explained it, right? Another set of alternative explanations involve task demands. That is, knowing somebody else understands something makes you feel like you should understand it. And so you're at least going to pretend you understand it by putting a higher number on the rating scale. We're also, the phenomenon I've described so far doesn't distinguish whether people feel they understand something better merely because the knowledge exists out there in the world or because they have access to that knowledge. And certainly Kyle's idea and the whole community of knowledge idea depends on having access to that knowledge. So in the second experiment, what we did was add a condition where the knowledge exists, but people don't have access to it because the explanation was generated by scientists working for the military and they're keeping it secret. Okay? So it's there, but you don't have access to it. So the descriptions are very similar to what I just showed you, but it's always DARPA that's publishing this study. And in one case, it's explained but secret. Another case, it's public. Another case, it's unexplained. And what we found is that it's only when it's public and explained that judgments are really high. Statistically, these two are the same. So having it be unexplained or secret, people have the same sense of understanding, whereas if they have access to the explanation, then their judgment goes up. Not a lot. It shouldn't go up a lot because they have no idea how this thing works, right? So what this shows is the existence of an alternative explanation is not sufficient for the community of knowledge. You need access to that explanation. Simple understandability account can't explain it. Neither can a simple task demand account. In the third experiment that I'll describe very briefly because I only have 1 minute left, we further tested the understandability and task demand alternative accounts by simply telling people at the end of the description of the phenomenon that this is something that's easy to understand or this is something that's very hard to understand. So if our results are due to task demands, then in the hard to understand condition, there shouldn't really be any social pressure anymore. Right? There's no pressure to say, I understand it, because I've said it's hard to understand, so the effect should disappear. Whereas in the easy to understand condition, we should find it in spades. At minimum, we should find a bigger effect in the easy to understand than the hard to understand case. The understandability account predicts that judgments of understanding should track whether the the phenomenon is described as easy or hard to understand, because that's what understandability is about. So for the understanding judgments, what we find is no effect of whether they're told it's easy, very easy, or very hard to understand, but we consistently find the effect of community of knowledge, that they have a greater sense of understanding when other scientists understand it. We also ask people to judge the understandability of the phenomena. And what we see is that the only significant effect here is that when the phenomena are described as easy to understand, judgments are higher than when they're hard to understand. So understanding does not actually track understandability, suggesting that understandability is not the whole story. So people conflate the knowledge in other people's minds with the knowledge in their own. And as long as information is accessible, it increases our sense of understanding. What does this tell us about wisdom? Well, it's clear, and in a sense we heard this earlier today by the philosopher, whose name I've forgotten, who was discussing the exemplar model of moral judgment and wisdom. We rely on each other for everything, for emotional support, for succor. Thinking itself, these data suggest, can confuse what's inside the skull and what's outside of it. So this work was actually funded by a different Templeton Foundation grant on humility. And I think there's a direct implication that we should be more intellectually humble because we don't understand very much, right? Or at least we don't understand very much outside our areas of expertise, is the right way to say it, speaking for most experts. And what's clear is that one implication concerning wisdom is that we should be aware of this, right? We should be aware that, that a wise person is one who accepts the truth that we share in a social mind, that the mind isn't only what's inside the skull. Thanks.
Much. Before you mentioned humility, I was going to ask you about humility and other things that could move these kinds of results, like awareness, reflection, openness to new information. So let me ask another question. What's striking, of course, is what you said about extreme beliefs, bias. So are there certain kinds of biases that when you learn how ignorant you are, you're actually falling back on your old beliefs more easy because of a certain nature of the bias? So it's often said people learn something when they have political beliefs, they learn something new and then, oh yeah, but, and then they fall back onto the old conspiracy theory or some kind of bias that they have. So enlightenment doesn't work. Are there certain kinds of biases that might work, that might be easier to move away from ignorance than others?
So I'm not sure I have a direct answer to your question. We've done a variety of studies where we've asked people to explain and tested whether they're more open to new information as a result. We've done this in the lab in a couple of days. In a couple of ways. We've also done it in a high school classroom. And the answer is no. That people aren't more open to new information simply because you've asked them to explain. It may be that discovering that you don't know how something works makes you feel like you don't understand the domain, and therefore you have negative associations with the domain. You just don't want to think about it anymore. You want to move on to something else that you do like, right? People prefer to do tasks in which they feel they have some expertise. Don't have a more direct answer to your question.
Katie?
Thanks, that was really interesting. I was wondering if rather than
thinking about this as a community of knowledge effect, if you could reframe things and think about this as a community of ignorance effect. So what I mean by that is rather than evidence that other people understanding something, moving you towards thinking that you understand something, evidence that there's a community of people who are ignorant would move you away from feeling like you understand something. So maybe in either the lack of knowledge or the secret example, you'd have evidence that there's a lot of people out there who don't understand something, then that could push you away from, a baseline feeling of understanding.
Perhaps, and that's something that could be tested, obviously, and maybe should be tested. It seems like half a dozen of one, 6 of the other, right? I mean, I think that what these results really reflect is that we live in a community and there's a division of cognitive labor. And so we're ignorant about the things we can get away with being ignorant about. And yet we lend our expertise where we can, right? Whether or not we're going to be more pushed around by the revelation of others' ignorance versus the knowledge of certain experts is an open question. We haven't looked at that.
Anne?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if maybe there's a pragmatic way in which the question is formed, thinking about Valerie's talk on standards, if perhaps the way the question is formed, your standards of what counts for knowledge and understanding change when you have been told that this is understood, and so your standard for what you're counting as understanding is somewhat lower or different in the two conditions. And that's a little bit less interesting than your community of knowledge kind of explanation.
So 2 things. Three things. One, I agree, right? So it could be in particular that people are confusing the question, do you understand, with a question like, is this something that you could understand given sufficient information? No, you have a different question in mind? What's the alternative question?
Some things they understand about it. They understand its material. They understand it's stable in this place. So when I judge my understanding of it, I do actually have a certain, my criteria for what I'm understanding.
I see. Okay. Right. So point 2, you've perhaps correctly rejected point 1. Point 2 was, it may be that when people are originally posed the question, they answer the extent to which they have successful intuitions with regard to the item, the policy, or the object. And when you ask them to explain, they reinterpret your question as, to what degree can I articulate knowledge about this object? In other words, to what degree do I have explicit access to a schema that I can manipulate? Right? So it's sort of intuitive knowledge versus declarative knowledge. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the effect had to do with people reinterpreting the question that way. We do get the effect when we test multiple items in series, right? So how well do you understand this? Explain it. Now how well do you understand it? How well do you understand something else? Explain it. Now how well do you understand it? So I don't think that's the complete story, because it's hard to imagine that they're flipping back and forth between different interpretations of the question, although that may be part of the story.
Albert?
Yeah.
And then Ursula.
I was wondering about individual differences. So it seems to me that there are people that think that they know a lot, and other people that seem to be more humble or more. And to what extent all these phenomenon are subject to individual differences, and whether those individual differences are a sign of wisdom.
So we don't have measures of intellectual arrogance versus intellectual humility, which I think is what you're asking for. I would doubt if those measures would be terribly predictive in this domain. I'll tell you what is predictive in this domain. The cognitive reflection test, right? So for those of you who don't know it, it's 3 simple questions. The first question is, a bat and a ball cost $1.10. Bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And everyone who hears this question, including those in the room, I surmise, have 10 cents come to mind. It's the wrong answer. The right answer is easy to generate. I'll let you generate it. But it requires a little bit of thought. You have to suppress this intuitive response, and then this declarative response, this calculated response, will emerge relatively easily. So 3 questions like that, 60% of the American population get 0 correct. About 15 to 20% get all 3 correct, and the rest lie in between. Those who get 2 or 3 correct do not show the illusion of explanatory depth, whereas those who get 0 or 1 correct do. So that's very predictive, right? So my interpretation of that is that some people, when you first ask, right, this is contra and suggestion, that when some people, when you ask them how well do you understand, they try to explain to themselves. They try to explain even before you ask them to explain. And thus their ratings are a little lower, even initially. So I don't think it's a matter of arrogance, right? I think it's just a matter of what the cognitive processes are that go into answering the question.
I wanted to come to your consequence that you drew for wisdom research, and the main inference you drew was for the humility that we would expect to see in someone wiser. But I think there's this other aspect that we have talked about all along, which I would like just for a shorthand version call mental effort, which I think also goes with wisdom. So I would expect not only should we be aware that we know nothing, which is the old Greek saying, but it is also that we make that extra effort and we go through try to gain a deeper understanding of events, circumstance, and do not accept the surface level of a given problem. So I was surprised that you wouldn't bring that in as a second inference.
Well, I'm not convinced that making the extra effort is always the wise thing to do. So all the psychologists in the room know the work of Schwartz. What's his first name?
Barry Schwartz.
Barry Schwartz, right? Who shows that people who maximize, who make an extra effort to always make the best decision, like buy the best pair of pants or buy.
That's not what I meant.
Okay.
It's not just, a quantitative more, but it is an awareness, not only that I know nothing, but an awareness that it takes, that as a consequence of this I know nothing, is not just then sit there and say, okay, that's what it is, I don't know anything, but you have to take the next step and find the best algorithm to go about a given problem, which is different from, just doing more of the same.
But it sounds like you are suggesting we should all be making this extra effort all the time. And I'm not sure that's not a recipe for disaster.
It's an algorithm, and the algorithm would determine when it is useful and when it is not useful to dig deeper. So it's not just a quantitative dimension.
So having access to that algorithm, knowing when you should dig deeper and when you shouldn't, that does sound like wisdom.
Thank you. Very nice.